One of the revelations and contributions of Philippinization is the failure of regional governments in resolving different disputes within the region.
Welcome to Baker's Dozen, a podcast about geopolitics from RANE, Risk Assistance Network and Exchange. I'm Roger Baker. The Philippines holds a strategic position in the West Pacific, not only geographically, but in the expanding competition between the United States and China. This is not a new reality for Manila. For much of its modern history, the Philippines has found itself stuck between bigger competing powers. Like many middle powers, the Philippines has sought different ways to manage its strategic security, including siding with one big power, most often the United States, balancing between competing powers, or getting together with the Southeast Asian states to increase their collective leverage. And like most countries, the Philippines seeks independence of action, asserting its own interests and strengths in an attempt to free itself from being buffeted by the winds of great power competition. Today I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Chester Cabalza, Don McLean Gill, and Joshua Bernard B. Espina of the Manila-based think tank International Development and Security Cooperation. They're the authors of a recent book on Manila's emerging grand strategy, The Rise of Philippinization. Thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having us, sir.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you, Roger, for the invitation.
So before we address this concept of Philippinization, I wonder if we could step back and take a minute, and could you describe the way Manila sees its geopolitical position? From a strategic perspective, how does the Philippines view itself and its regional relations?
Well, for the longest time, Manila has been depending on Washington, given that it's Asia's longest treaty ally, and nevertheless, we have not seen so much closer relation except with Washington until such a time when President Duterte became the leader of the Philippines. He tried to diversify its foreign relations and started engaging with China and Russia and some other major powers. And that's the time that the Philippines was a little bit confused because there was no clear independent foreign policy at the time. And of course, given that there's a very confusing relationship with Washington, given the love-hate relationship that we have with the U.S., that's the time that Manila started to get confused of its relations with all these major powers. And I think that's the reason why we have concocted the term Philippinization, because while Washington is trying to support us, especially in our case in the West Philippine Sea, we are also engaging with China, given that China has a belligerent and hostile relationship with Manila, especially with the things in the West Philippine Sea.
And if I could just add on to that real quick, in line with what Dr. Chester said, and I believe that this is a great point to start the conversation with, is that the Philippines' current position, geopolitically speaking, has often been seen as a constraint rather than as an opportunity. And it is often seen to be boxed in amid the major power competition between the United States and China, and is primarily constrained with its immediate interests in Southeast Asia and its immediate periphery. And this is really what got us going with the concept of Philippinization, is to present a more pragmatic, practical approach and harness the Philippines' geostrategic position to be able to go beyond the common mainstream narratives of what it is seen as. And this is the chance for us to demonstrate how the Philippine position can be used to its advantage in the long term amid the geopolitical shifts that are occurring.
And also to add to Dr. Chester and Don, what just had said, perhaps I'll be delving on to the domestic condition, particularly what the security community has been tackling or confronting regarding this issue, this geostrategic condition. Particularly when we try to discuss things with the armed forces of the Philippines, with the defense community, we would see their delicate viewpoint regarding their alliance with the United States, whereas they are indeed a needed ally against rising power, that is China. We also confront questions regarding the political leadership's utility about the military, where in fact, while the military has been continuing its modernization program, we can see the political leadership trying to also open some sort of rapprochement with the with the Chinese. So therein lies questions whether the military would be really a useful tool in trying to get the country's way in this delicate region. So that's all.
So it's interesting as we look at the Philippines' position geographically, it sits right at this crossroads. It's part of the north-south route between Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. It's the western center frontier of what the Chinese view as U.S. containment or encirclement of China. It's a potential gateway for the Chinese out into the Pacific. And of course, as a country in and of itself, it's got a vast amount of natural resources, of human capital available. It becomes an important place. And as you have discussed in your book, you talk about this idea of Philippinization. And you note that, and it's a good time now to talk about it since we mentioned it but haven't really explained it. You note, though, that it's different than Finlandization, which is, of course, a term I think that people are more used to hearing, which is effectively the idea that a country becomes a neutral buffer between two great powers. And that, of course, is back in the public consciousness today as both Finland and its neighbor Sweden are starting to actually consider potential NATO membership and no longer feeling like they're capable of not picking sides or of being a forced buffer between powers, especially as we see what's happening in Ukraine. So how do you define then this concept of Philippinization? How does it differ from Finlandization? And what makes this a more viable strategy for Manila?
Well, that's an interesting comparison and contrast with the Finlandization. Basically, that was also the idea when we started writing about the book, when we gathered a number of scholars, young scholars in Manila. There was a contention, what should we be calling about this book? Is it going to be Finlandization of Manila? No, I said it's a different thing because I've been traveling around Finland back in 2017 to 2019 and I saw some differences in terms of the texture and of course about how do we define Finlandization to Philippinization. When we talk about Philippinization, this is the process whereby a weaker state backed by a powerful country that refers to the United States goes through great lengths in temporarily refraining from opposing a neighboring great power that is China by resorting to economic and diplomatic rapprochements at the strategic level but strengthening its national security infrastructure referring to the Philippines on the operational level with an eye for potential conflict in the foreseeable future. So herein, even if we try to connect it with Finlandization, which has become a political concept for many generations, we saw that Finlandization is a product of the Cold War, given that, of course, we have the Ukraine-Russia conflict right now. And also, the difference is that Finland was basically subdued by Russia. That's the reason why it was amputated by the Russian forces, given that, of course, in their geography, same as size of the Philippines, it was amputated and generally Finland has to pay for repatriation with Russia. But that's a different thing with what happened in the Philippines. We are still struggling for our sovereignty, and at the same time, we are being supported by the United States, given that, of course, you have the Indo-Pacific region here, and of course, China is trying to assert and flexes its muscle, basically. And at the same time, it is also helping the Philippines economically speaking. So you see, there's a big difference in the difference in Finlandization and Philippinization, and I think my colleagues here in their chapters when they wrote it, they have visualized a different scenario where Philippinization works.
And just to add to that as well, it's very important that you made this particular comparison between Finlandization and Philippinization, and you have rightfully said that Finlandization really talks about the concept of buffering, buffer states for that matter, and the problem with that is, compared to Philippinization, is that Finlandization is a static concept. It visualizes a state as a buffer amid the power competition between greater powers, but Philippinization allows for more evolution. It allows for growth for a particular state. So in this context, the Philippines, given its current situation, is trying to find the middle way between the United States and China, but at the same time, it is striving to go beyond this particular predicament by enhancing its material capabilities and by engaging beyond the mainstream and traditional partnerships that it has harnessed throughout the years. And this includes the particular chapter that I wrote on the Philippine position in the Indo-Pacific, that the Philippines is a democratic country that adheres to the maintenance of the rules-based order. And being geographically situated at the heart of the Indo-Pacific and having robust connections throughout ASEAN and increasing connections with other major Indo-Pacific powers such as Australia, Japan, and India. This is the potential for the Philippines to break out of its particularly constrained conception of being primarily in Southeast Asia, and to engage with partners that it has not been able to engage with in the past few years as effectively. So this is the opportunity that we are trying to show here through Philippinization, that it is not static, that the Philippines is growing, is processing towards a more conducive future based on its national interest.
And to add off from Dr. Chester and Don, I consider Finlandization a rather pejorative term, whereas Philippinization as a possibly dynamic term for developing strategic options. And also, we have to understand that Finlandization, when you look at the geopolitical setting, Finlandization occurred in a place whereby land power prevailed over this scenario. Whereas Philippinization, we have to understand, we're situated in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore it is very much different from the Finlandization experience. Philippinization is situated whereby sea power is very much important, whereas no one can really own the sea that much. And at the same time, we are all living in a global maritime domain, which is a common domain, and therefore we have to understand that the Philippines doesn't have to consider what what Finland has also experienced, for the reason that Finlandization happened after a war, the Russo-Finnish War in the 1940s, whereas Philippinization prepares the country for a potential conflict of the foreseeable future.
So I think that's really important. As you guys note, there's a maritime component to this, which creates a different set of constraints and a different set of options for the Philippines than perhaps a place like Finland had during the Cold War. Yet we have seen, for example, China encroaching on and occupying Philippine claimed territory in the Philippine Sea, in the South China Sea, and we have seen Beijing using economic and military coercion to try and shape the direction of Philippine foreign policy, and obviously the long-standing political and economic relationship with the United States in some ways tries to influence the direction of Philippine foreign policy. So in some sense, what you're describing is a way for the Philippines to be a proactive agent of its own future rather than just a country that's buffeted between these big powers.
That is exactly what we're trying to advance, actually, because we have to understand the Philippines is a middle power. We are not a small power, because when we try to look at the international system, small powers are rather passive uh, and after all, a very reactive uh, actor. Whereas a middle power, even though it has a minimal military capability, which can hardly challenge a great power, nonetheless, it has other components such as the diplomatic networks. We've seen it in different power indices, such as of the Lowy Institute. So what I'm trying to say here is that a middle power such as the Philippines can use and utilize other state instruments. And that is why we have come up with the idea that a middle power can can maximize its diplomatic capital in order to build defense networks, economic regional powerhouses in order to up its game, so that in the future we might have a formidable defense capability. So here I consider that being a middle power doesn't stay a static or in such a way that it will be forever a middle power. Possibly it can rise up to the ashes of being a passive power, which the Philippines has experienced under a very different security perception, being an ally of the United States.
Maybe Don can deliver first his insights before I'll give mine.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Chester. And yes, absolutely. And it's this particular process that differentiates Philippinization from Finlandization, as my co-authors have rightfully pointed out. And this is something that we are hoping that this concept would be able to be applied not only for the Philippines, but also for other states, particularly how Finlandization became a general concept to talk about states that are in the buffer between major powers. Philippinization allows for more flexibility, and it's a forward-looking framework that really allows states to go beyond acting merely as a buffer, but as you have rightfully said, Mr. Roger, to try to actually pave the way towards their own interest. And this is absolutely important, given, of course, the dynamic shifts that are occurring in the global geopolitical landscape. And this, we believe, is something that is timely as well, considering that power shifts are also quite fluid. And this, we believe, would also complement the current dynamics of the international system and would be able to adjust properly throughout the future as well. So we devised a flexible concept that would be able to explain the past, the present, and hopefully the future as well.
Well, thank you for that, Don and Joshua. No, but definitely, there are a number of revelations in this book, given, of course, what Joshua has talk about the Philippines' middle power status, and of course, definitely, even great, small, and middle powers have also grand strategies, which we showed here that given that the Philippines has gained a lot of praises on its lawfare, but nonetheless, we also have seen that Manila, definitely, particularly this incumbent government, was not able to utilize properly this power on leveraging its relations with Beijing. And also, one of the conditions in this book is that, of course, given that, of course, Southeast Asia has also become a battleground for this buffering status of major powers, and also like what you said, Mr. Roger, about the maritime status, given that of course we've seen the rise of the Indo-Pacific region, and also we've seen a number of middle power countries in Southeast Asia trying to invalidate the different hedging strategies of these other small state actors in Southeast Asia. But nonetheless, moreover, Philippinization will give us a prospect that even middle powers have the power to basically attract major powers, and it can redirect its foreign and defense policies, given by utilizing all forms of national power that they have basically.
As you've noted, And I think it's interesting, the idea that, like, Finlandization became a term that was potentially utilizable in other parts of looking at the world system. You're talking about this idea of Philippinization being one that can carry on to other countries, obviously in their own unique way. Um, what other countries in the region are you seeing? One that comes to my mind is potentially thinking in the long term about a country like South Korea, for example, that is has a close security relationship with the United States, but is also working very hard to have a fairly strong independent national security, maintains relatively strong economic ties with China, even until recent events with Russia. And so is trying to find that way to walk its own path. And I guess as you think about other countries that may have this, what might be some of the risks or challenges? For example, in the Philippinization idea that you lay out, um, in the end, it's about strengthening national security for expectations of a future potential confrontation, and maybe being able to either stand up on their own or deter that future confrontation. So there's that sense of stress or conflict down the road. Is it possible for a country in their pursuit of strengthening themselves while trying to manage competing big powers that their security partner wanes before they're actually ready to be able to stand up for themselves?
That's absolutely right, Mr. Roger, and you have rightfully mentioned an example for South Korea, that matter, and the need to understand that Philippinization involves, of course, it's not a smooth sailing process. It's not a one-way path without the challenges and constraints. Like any policy orientation, there are risks that are involved, and particularly what we have introduced in Philippinization, in line with the Philippines for that matter, is the role of perception. Yes, materially speaking, in terms of material capabilities, the Philippines is a middle power for that matter, and geopolitically speaking, it is pivotal in terms of the Indo-Pacific as a whole and beyond. However, the lack of awareness to harness these particular material capabilities has impeded the Philippines' potential to forward and secure its national interests quicker than we wanted it to. So this is one of the many constraints, of course, that countries can face in terms of leveraging their potential towards the path of Philippinization. And that in itself is a challenge, of course, for many countries, and even for South Korea for that matter, is power and perception go hand in hand in this particular concept, and we have devised it to go beyond the rigid narratives of dominant theories, of course, such as realism, that sort of box in particular states based only on material capabilities, and we have added that flexibility of perception along with power to be able to see the trajectory of a number of states, including the Philippines. So yes, the concept is there, the path has been laid out, but the level of and the speed of a state's performance towards that particular goal that we have envisioned in Philippinization will depend on a number of factors and challenges and obstacles, one of which would be the perception, and having a domestically cohesive and unified approach towards harnessing these capabilities. So they play along the whole process, and this actually complicates the equation further. But at the same time, if played right, this would be able to be a stepping stone for more to come.
And to add from Don's perception, from to add from Don's perception factor, I remember the late strategist Colin Gray had said that time is the least forgiving dimension of strategy, and this is exactly it. That Philippinization offers you a proper framework for strategists, defense communities to think about their national security strategy in a limited framework of time. for the reason that power shift can be volatile. Okay, so in that sense, Philippinization is a very practical framework for security communities, political leadership, because as you have mentioned, Sir Roger, is that perhaps the stronger power, which we have mentioned in our definition, may wane over time. And that is the challenge for the United States, experiencing domestic turmoil, economic instability, politico-diplomatic insufficiencies right now with the issue of Ukraine crisis, and and so much more. So again, yes, Philippinization provides you a practical framework in order for the scholars, political leadership, and security communities to realize that time is of the essence, and great power politics is a dangerous business.
Well, I think one of the revelations and I think contributions of Philippinization is the failure of regional governments in resolving different disputes within the region. Like what happened in the Philippines, we've lobbied this problem on the West Philippine Sea in Southeast Asia through ASEAN, but basically ASEAN was not the answer for it. That's the reason why the Philippines, internationalized its cause and was able to get an arbitration award from the Permanent Court of Arbitration. Same as true as what is happening right now in Russia-Ukraine conflict, where we see a power struggle between a great power and a middle power, and Ukraine basically doesn't can fit to this kind of Philippinization, where it tries to lobby with the European Union, and we'll see what happens later on if the EU will technically accept Ukraine, given all the different factors that we are seeing in these current competition of powers in the Balkan region. And definitely, Philippinization will be can be used in this kind of allegory and comparison contrast, basically based from the concepts of international relations and national security and power relations, basically. So, nevertheless, just like what Finlandization has sowed through different generations, we were looking forward that perhaps this Philippinization can be used in succeeding generations also, as what we have described in the book, basically.
Well, that's really rather interesting, and as you mentioned in the book, there's a lot of really useful elements that you all raise, looking at the history of the Philippines, looking at its regional relations, looking at its relation with its core alliance and the evolution of that over time, and ultimately coming to this primary concept. And well, I would love to keep this conversation going for another 20, 30 minutes. I think we're pushing the end of our time here, and a lot more to say, and worth taking a look at this book. But I want to thank all of you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for us.
An honor.
Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Chester Cabalza, with Don McLean Gill, and with Joshua Bernard Villaspeña today. They're the authors of the book on Philippinization, and they join us from the International Development and Security Cooperation, IDSC. As we think about this concept of Philippinization, I think it's interesting because, as we've heard, this is something that, unlike Finlandization, which is very much from a bipolar global system, Philippinization seems to be a concept that may fit for the rising role of middle powers in a multipolar world system. And definitely something to think about as we look forward. And if you're interested in keeping abreast of geopolitical trends in the region and the world, subscribe to RANE's Worldview. Go to worldview.stratfor.com. That's worldview.stratfor.com. I'm Roger Baker, and thank you for listening.